In this tutorial you will learn the basics of animation in Unity 3D, how to create moving platforms like this, bridges that lower down automatically when standing in front of them, as well as patrolling enemies, and just cool looking stuff like this right here. Timestamps and a download link for this are in the description. This is basically part 3 of my Unity tutorial series for beginners. If you haven't seen part 1 and 2, doesn't matter, you don't need them. If you have seen part 1 and 2, great, because this will open up a lot of new creative possibilities for you to play around with. Let's go. Animating in Unity is fairly easy. If you want to animate something, just select the object you want to animate, then click on Window, Animation, and Animation. Then this window here will pop up, which you can also put somewhere in your interface. You simply click Create to create a new animation, then it will ask you where you want to save that animation. I usually just create a new folder for that. You can also give your animation a name. I'll just call this one Cube Test. Then this will show up, this timeline. You can move to the left and right by holding the middle mouse button in this timeline. Then you can zoom in and out with the mouse wheel. You can hit play with space, so the animation starts playing. You see how long it is. At the moment it's 1 second long. And now if we want to animate this, the easiest way to do so is just to hit this little record button right here, click, and then just wiggle this around a little bit, and then you can see here the properties that were recorded by Unity are the position of the cube. Now if we move to a different position of the timeline, for example to 1 second, and just move the cube over here, then now the cube will move from here to here, and we have successfully created our first animation. Yay! Of course, you can see that it then snaps back to the beginning once the animation stops. If you want to make an animation that loops, there's a very simple way to do that as well. The only thing you need to do in order to create a looping animation is to make sure that the last keyframe is the same as the first keyframe. So what you can do here is, of course, selecting keyframes, moving them around. If you want to duplicate those, we can just hit Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V, and we'll have the exact same keyframe over here, where now it moves to the left, and then it moves back. Now if we have a look at the cube, we can see that an animator component was automatically attached to it. Of course, note that you cannot animate this cube when it's not selected. For example, if I select this cube in the background here, there's no animation here. You need to select the correct object in order to work on the animation. And then whenever you create the first animation for an object, there's another thing that is created automatically, which is this controller right here. If we double click that, this window here will open, which we can later use to transition between different animations. You can see here, this is the animation we created, Cube Test, that's how I called the animation. And of course, sometimes you want to transition from one animation to another one. That's what this window is all about. The animator window is this one, and then the animation window is this one down here. Well, let's not worry about that one. I just wanted to let you know that this animator exists as well. And in fact, that animator is in here as well with the animation. Here we can see the animation we created. If I double click that, this timeline opens, I can see the animation. And if I click this, then the animation controller opens, and I can see how different animations transition between each other. Entry just means this is the beginning that is played at the start, and you can see that is connected to Cube Test, so that will just be the animation that is played from the start. If you want to change the speed of the animation, you can do so here in the animator window. For example, I can reduce the speed of that animation to 0.25. Now it should be played at a lot slower pace once I hit play. Which is in fact the case. If I set that to 2, then the animation will be a lot faster. Now here are two big issues I ran into when I started animating stuff in Unity. The first one is when you attach a rigid body to the object, it actually doesn't do anything. If the animation is animating the position of the object, then what's happening is that the animation is constantly overwriting the position up here, the position coordinates. So all of that physics stuff falling down, etc., will not work. And then the other thing that is really annoying if you don't know how to deal with it is that you cannot move this cube anymore. For example, if I want to move this cube, see, at the moment it starts in the center of the screen, this is the camera view. If I want to move this further to the left, so it starts over here, yes, I can do that. But once the animation starts playing, so once I hit play, let's just hit play, it pops back to the center. And once again, the reason for that is because I animated the position of this object, right? This animation at the beginning of the frame sets the position exactly to these coordinates. So pretty much no matter where I move this block, I can also move it completely into the nirvana, doesn't really matter. If I hit play, it will still come back to the position where you animated it. So how do you deal with those things? luckily there is a solution. First of all, let me just delete those animations, because as you can see, that's clearly not the way to do it. So the only way you can make that work, unfortunately, is by creating an empty object. Cube parent, and put the cube inside that. Make sure that the cube parent has the scale 1, 1, 1. And make sure that the cube inside the cube parent has the position 0, 0, 0. So they're both at the same position. And now what we can do is we can animate this object in here. Let's just create a new animation in here. And now we can do pretty much the exact same thing. We'll hit the record button, wiggle this object around a little bit here. And at the 30-second mark, perhaps I'll move it up a little bit. 1 second mark here, half a second, 1 second. I'll move it back down. So now it's moving up and down. But the difference this time is that this animation is actually happening inside a parent object. See, so we're overwriting the position inside of the parent object. We are overwriting the position relative to the parent object. But the actual coordinates of the parent object are not animated. So that means we can change the coordinates of that parent object in whatever way we please. Now, once again, if we move the cube inside here, it will absolutely have make no difference. Like once we hit play, it will go back to where it started. But what we can do is we can move this cube parent around now. So now I can have one here, I can have one here, here, here. And they all are animated relative to their parent object, which allows me to move them around, which is very, very nice. Yeah! And that once again probably allows us to do some pretty interesting stuff. Perhaps we should give these cube parents a little icon here so we can see where they are. You can just do that by clicking here and then selecting one of these little images. So now if I accidentally grab one of these cubes, I can see that I'd moved the wrong object. So the cool thing is now we can go pretty wild with this. For example, I can duplicate this cube parent and I can put it inside this cube. So an animated object inside an animated object. Now we have two cubes, and then we can even rotate these objects. For example, I can rotate that to the side now, which will result in an animation that looks like this. Then what if I rotate this cube parent here by another 90 degrees, and we'll have an animation that looks like this. So with all of the knowledge you have right now, I'd really encourage you to play around a little bit and see if you can just build something that looks cool. That's a nice exercise, nice practice. For example, what I can do with this is duplicating this a couple of times in different rotations. Just by duplicating this animation a couple of times, now we suddenly have something that looks like this, which is very nice. Why don't we duplicate that again? And this time rotate it around this axis here. Very cool. What if I want this entire object to rotate now? What I can do for this is once again just putting this into a parent object, calling this parent object, for example, star. Let's put all of these cubes inside of our star. And then I want to animate the rotation and the scale of this. As long as I'm not animating the position, by the way, I can put the animation directly onto this object. If I wanted to animate the position, I would once again put this star inside another empty object to make sure that I can still move the object around after the fact. But as I don't plan to animate the position, I can just do it right here. Click create animation. Here we go. I'll click the record button, wiggle around the rotation a bit. Here we go. Now the rotation's in there. Maybe it should take about 7 seconds to make one full turn. So I'll just go to the 7-second marker and enter 360 degrees for my rotation here. I accidentally got the position in here as well. Started animating the position. That's what I didn't want. So let's remove these properties, and then all you're left with is a rotation. Here you can see the properties that are animated. Okay, and as you can see, it's not really rotating properly around its center, which in some cases is what you want. In this case, it's not really. I'll just set the relative position of all of these to 0. Make sure that you're not having this record button selected here whenever you do stuff like that. Just uncheck that. And then I can set this to 0. This is not something I want to animate. I just want it to be in the center, please. And now we can see that it's rotating properly around the center, because all of these objects are actually in the center of this object, of course. If we grab all of these, right, move them further away, and then let's give the star here a yellow dot so we can see where it is. Of course, now if we start rotating this yellow dot and this is inside the yellow dot, then of course everything will rotate around the yellow block. So that's also kind of a technique you can use to do that if that's what you want. But if you don't want that, then just make sure everything's centered correctly. And now one thing you can see here when we hit play is that it kind of starts off slowly and then also stops slowly in the end. And I don't want that. I just want it to be a smooth transition. See, it kind of stops here and then it starts rotating again. The reason for that is these animations are smoothed by default, which is nice usually, but in some cases you don't want that. So if you want to see a little more in detail what's going on here, you can actually click on curves down here in your animation window. You can switch back and forth between drop sheet and curves. And in curves you can just see a little in more detail what's happening. Once again, you can zoom in and out with the mouse wheel. If you just want to zoom out in the x-axis, you hit Control and scroll in and out. If you want to scroll only in the y-axis, you hit Shift and scroll up and down. And you can see this is the rotation that I animated, and it's a smooth curve. If I want to turn that into a straight curve, I could just grab these handles, and try to smooth it out manually. However, the easier way is to just right click on this keyframe, then go to both tangents and click linear, which will just remove those handles altogether and make sure it's a linear transition instead of a smooth one. Let's right click here as well. Select linear, and now we have a very linear straight animation that just gives this a very smooth rotation. And yeah, it loops perfectly. That's exactly what I wanted. Very, very nice. And now the fun comes in when we play both of those animations at once, right? So when we hit play, we can see now that both of those animations are playing, which looks really cool. By the way, one little mistake that seems to happen to some people is that they zoom in the game window here, which will obviously make everything very, very pixelated. So in case that happens, just zoom out. Just don't zoom in the game window. Here, in the scene window, here you can zoom in without danger. And now, of course, we can keep playing this game, right? We can just create a new child object here, or a parent object here, for example. I'll call that orbit. And this orbit, I'll just give this a nice little handle so I can see where it is. What if we give this orbit multiple stars? Let's put these stars inside of the orbit. Just using the coordinates here to align this perfectly the way I want. Okay, very nice. Now I can give this orbit an animation as well. Selecting the orbit, going through the animation window, clicking create animation. This time I want to animate size and rotation. One thing to note, of course, is that if we animate the size here, then yes, this will in fact override the size variable, meaning that it will not be possible for us to change the size of this later on, except for when we put this inside of another object, then we can change the size again. Okay, so now it has a little bit of a wobble animation, getting smaller and bigger. Let's stretch that out a bit longer. When you have multiple keyframes selected, you can just stretch them like this. If you want to go exactly to the next keyframe, you can use this button here. This will jump the pointer directly on top of the next keyframe. This one to the last keyframe, this to the very end, and this one to the very beginning of the animation. This is quite useful because, of course, if you want to edit a keyframe, you need to be exactly on top of it. For example, if I go here slightly before the keyframe, if I change something here, then of course there will be an animation between those two keyframes, even though they're very close together. So just make sure that when you change a keyframe, you're exactly on top of it. That is quite interesting. I feel like the initial animation we made should be a little slower, so I'll go to our cube animator and just slow that animation down a little bit here, cube test. Actually go back to 0.25. I feel like that will make the animation a bit more chill. Yeah. And now one of the cool things we can do with this as well is, for example, we can also just animate the camera position exactly the same way. Just selecting the camera, hitting create animation, then I'll hit record, put the camera here, make sure that the animation ends with that keyframe as well. And of course this animation is too fast, I'll just zoom out, select the entire animation, make it a little bit longer. Yeah, this looks nice and smooth. We can see our beautiful animation in action. Now I just added a custom skybox that is a little more purple, yellowish. If you want to know how to do that, you basically just create a material, and then for the material shader you select skybox procedural, and then once you have that you can change the skybox color, and then in your lighting tab, which you can open with window, rendering, lighting settings. Here you can select your skybox, so you can just select your custom skybox there. And then I added a cool backlight, this fill light here. And suddenly we have something that looks like this. Hell yeah, that looks quite cool. That is our first result of the day. Knowing what you know now, you can obviously start utilizing this for gameplay purposes as well. For example, we can turn this block into an elevator that drives back and forth between those two locations. Great animation. Now if we hit play, we should be able to use that elevator, get on there, and here we are. It works. The only thing you might notice is that this elevator doesn't really have any physical properties, meaning it doesn't really accelerate the ball. That is the case because this is not a rigid body. But there is a way we can make this work in a physical way as well. Let's just clear everything from our animation in here. And now what we can do is we can give this a rigid body. And then the axes we want to freeze are the Y and the Z axis, as the elevator is only supposed to move on the X axis, right? Here in the rigid body we'll freeze Y and Z is what I want to freeze. And then I also want to freeze the rotation so this elevator doesn't rotate in any weird ways. And then we'll just tell this to interpolate to make it look a little nicer. And we already made a script in one of the recent tutorials that is called add constant velocity. Pretty much all the script does is it applies velocity to this object. This right here is literally the entire script. There's just velocity, and in the fixed update we add that velocity to that object. And the cool thing is we can also animate those parameters in that object. So what we can do is hit record, and then at the beginning we set the velocity to 0.1. A bit later we'll set it to minus 0.1 to make the elevator move in the opposite direction, and then we'll turn it around, make it turn around again to make the animation loop. And let's stretch that over the course of, let's say, 10 seconds. And now this elevator should actually work in a way that is physically more correct. As you can see now, it interacts in a more physically correct way with us. So yeah, now we get some real momentum from being on here. Now once you're past that elevator, I here want to have a bridge that automatically lowers down when the player's in the correct position, just like that. At the beginning the bridge should be like this, and then once the player is in the correct position, I want it to lower down. And by the way you can make a block tilt like that is once again by putting it into a child object right here, right? Because if you just rotate this right here, then it doesn't rotate around the correct position. But if you have another object that you offset by a little bit, and then you put that bridge into that object, then once you start rotating the object here from the coordinates, it will rotate from this new pivot here, which is always very useful for animating, knowing how you can offset pivots like that. And now for this bridge, I will actually create two animations. I'll create one idle animation. Why would a bridge need an idle animation like that? I have no idea. Maybe it's broken, maybe it's yeah, it looks like it's broken. Can't close. That is our first animation. Now if you want to add a second animation to an object, because objects can have multiple animations, you click here and select create new clip, and then you can just create a new clip for this, and this one will be bridge closed. So basically, how will the bridge look like when it's closed? This will be a very simple animation because it won't even be an animation. I'll just rotate this down here. Voila. So that's it. An animation can also just be one keyframe. Once the bridge is down here, I don't really want it to be animated, so that will just be one keyframe animation. Now what we can do is we can go into that brip animator. We should now see both of those animation clips that we've created, right? We have bridge idle, which is the one that will be played by default. We can see that from entry we'll go to bridge idle, so this animation will play on by default. If you want to change the default animation from this to this, then what you can do is you can right click onto entry, set machine default state, and then you can just drag the arrow to this, so now the default state will be closed. But in fact, we want the default state to be bridge idle, and then from bridge idle we want the animation to be able to transition to the closed bridge, right? To these transitions you can actually apply certain conditions if you want. If you don't apply any conditions, then after playing this animation once, the animation will just continue onwards to this. It instantly falls down because the idle animation is just played once, and then it instantly goes to the bridge closed state. We can also change the length of that transition here, by the way. If we want that transition to be a lot longer, we can just make it longer here, and now the bridge should close down a lot more slowly. But we don't really want the bridge to close down right away, right? We kind of want this animation to be triggered only under specific circumstances, and that's why there are certain parameters over here. You can see there are layers and parameters. We'll not worry about layers. You can create a new parameter by clicking the plus here, and a parameter is basically a variable that can help you to transition between these states. For example, in this case, we can use a trigger, and we can call this trigger lower bridge. As soon as it is triggered, we can trigger this animation, for example. For the conditions, we can ask for certain floats, integers, or also for certain triggers. So now this transition from this animation to this animation, from bridge idle to bridge closed, will be triggered by this trigger right here, lower bridge. And there's actually an easy way you can test this. Just put your animator window over here and then hit play. And now we can see that the idle animation of the bridge is playing, right? We can see it wiggling around here. So that idle animation is clearly working. And now you can just manually trigger that trigger by clicking on this little trigger icon here. And that will lower the bridge, and that way you know that it's working. Just to show you how some of the other parameters look like, for example, you could also do an integer, call this int test, and then as a condition, for example, you could add that this integer has to be greater, less, or equal to a certain value. For example, it has to be greater than 3 in order for this animation to be triggered. So you can just code some basic logic in here. Now if you activate that trigger, you can see nothing happens because this integer here is not greater than 3, but if we put that integer on 4, and then activate that trigger, that bool more or less, then we can get over there. As you're probably guessing, we can also trigger or change these triggers and integers from code. So that's what we're gonna do next. So we'll make this based on the trigger. That is a nicer way to do it for now. So how do we set that trigger? Very good question. Glad you asked. New scripty script. And I call this script bridge and put that onto the bridge object. Bridge object has an animator attached to it and it has the bridge script. So we can get the animator by writing animator. And then in the start event, we can get the component equals get component animator. Now we have the animator, and now just for the sake of testing, let's say if input dot get key down key code q. So once we press q, we'll set animator dot z trigger. We can also use z float or z integer if you want to use some of these other variables I've shown you, but in this case it's a trigger. Z trigger, and that trigger is called lower bridge. And there's also another function called reset trigger that you can use to set the trigger to false again. But in this case, we don't need that. In this case, we just need to set it to true. And then once it's on true, it can stay on true for all we care. So that's a very simple script, as you can see. And what this should cause is it should lower the bridge once we hit Q. The bridge is playing the idle animation. Now, once I hit Q, the bridge will lower down. With a bit of delay, actually, you can get rid of that delay by dechecking has exit time here in the animator. What this does is it basically waits for the current animation to finish before the transition starts. We don't want that, we just want the transition to happen right away. So I'll uncheck that has exit time, and now it should react a bit more instantly once I hit Q. Yes, it instantly lowers down. That is very nice. As you can see, in professional YouTuber fashion, I accidentally activated my stream overlay. Don't worry, that will be gone in a sec. But also, what a great opportunity to plug my game, Will You Snail? If you have a second to spare, it would be really great if you could check it out on Steam and hit the wishlist button if you like what you're seeing, because I think this is a really unique and crazy platformer. Something unlike everything you've played before. Very easy and great way to support this channel and tutorials like this. Thank you, thank you. So that is one way you can control that. The other way is we could also just put a trigger zone here, and then once the ball is inside the trigger zone, we could make that bridge lower down automatically, which is what we'll try to do now. So for that, I'm afraid I'll have to put this entire bridge into another parent object in order to make that work properly. Let's call that bridge parent. Copy the position of the bridge here by clicking the little gear wheel, copy component, paste component values, and then before I drag the bridge, and I'll just set the scale to 1, 1, 1 and rotation 0, 0, 0. Now I can put the bridge in there, and now I have a nice bridge parent that I can use. And in fact, I'll actually put the bridge script onto that and remove it here from the actual bridge. Now, of course, it will not work anymore because this script right here, or this object, does not have an animator. So what I need to do instead of get component is just get component in children. And this way we can still get the animator. We'll just get the animator of this child object right here, and everything will still work fine. Yes, everything's still working fine. Excellent. Because now what we can do is we can actually put a box collider in here. Box collider. Can set that to isTrigger. And then we can move that box collider over here by playing with these variables. You can see the collider here in that slight green outline. We can make that a bit bigger, move it up a little bit. Et voila, we have a nice trigger zone that we can use. So this player already has the tag player. Now I'll just check if something with the tag player enters this trigger zone right here. All we need to do in our bridge script is just say on trigger enter, and then we'll say if other, let's rename that to collider. The collider that entered the trigger, if the collider tag is player, then we'll lower the bridge, meaning that now we can remove that from the update. I'll probably remove that update function altogether, make it a bit more clean. So now all the script does is once something enters the trigger and the collider that entered the trigger has the tag player, then we'll trigger the animation to lower the bridge. Also, by the way, note that there's no animation where the bridge actually closes, right? It's just here it is closed and here it is wiggling around, and then the actual closing animation happens because Unity is transitioning smoothly between those two animations, blending between those animations. So that's how this closing happens in the first place. You can see this bridge jiggling around here. Now I've entered the trigger zone and the bridge is lowered down. It's a little hard to see in this direction. Let's actually duplicate this bridge and put another one here. We can get to the other side again. Here, once I'm in front of the bridge, it lowers down. I can get past it. Once I'm in front of the bridge, it lowers down, I can get past it, which is very, very nice. Now while we're at it, let's also give our ball here a little bit of an animation. I'll just start out by animating one of these rings here, making that flip from one side to another. So now this ball also has a little bit of an animation. Like, you really have to understand that being able to animate stuff opens up so many new creative possibilities. For example, I can create some patrolling enemies right here. I'd really encourage you to try that out by yourself, but if you want to see how it's done, we can just create a new sphere, put that into an empty object called enemy parent, and then in there we'll have the enemy, because this enemy will move and we want to put this in multiple locations in the level, so that's why it's important to put it into a parent. Let's make that orange real quick. Go to the animation tab, hit record or create animation. Now we can make this move from here to the other side and then back. Okay, what you need to do in order to restart the level properly is just on these enemy objects, not on these parents. On these enemy objects there needs to be a script called restart level on collision, and then we'll restart the level when we collide with the player. This is, by the way, is one of the scripts we wrote in one of the recent tutorials. You might not have this, but once again, it's a very simple script that just looks like this. Restarts the level once you hit something, and that needs to be directly on the enemy. So now we have some patrolling enemies that once we collide with them, boop, the level restarts. So I would say this is done now. This level has elevators, bridges that lower down automatically, and patrolling enemies. Like, there's just so much creative stuff you can do with this. That's absolutely awesome. Being able to animate stuff in Unity is so useful. I'd encourage you to go absolutely wild with this. There are so many creative things you can do with this now. What about vertical elevators, or what about game worlds that slowly morph and change over time? Switches that open or close doors in a different part of the level? Or what about giant animated crowds of enemies you have to dodge as a player? Being able to animate opens up a billion different movement patterns you can give to enemies and objects in your level. The opportunities are absolutely endless. In case you run into any technical difficulties, I highly recommend you join our Discord server. There are a bunch of nice people there who will probably help you out with your problem. For more awesome game development content, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.